Welcome to Bamfordrose, and it's forum chat time. Before we get into this week's forum chat, really helps us if you can subscribe to our channel, click us a like and give us your comments on this week's forum chat, which is about Aston Martin and engine repairs. So I've noticed on quite a few forums that just recently some unfortunate people seem to have suffered problems with their engine. Now, if you have an engine go catastrophically wrong and it needs taken out of the car to fix, in your Aston, this is a serious problem, not just because of the cost, but because of parts availability and of remanufactured engine availability. So we'll just quickly go through the common causes of failure, repair options available, but most importantly, preventative maintenance that you can do to ensure or limit the risk that an engine failure doesn't occur to you. So covering the V8 engine first, then it can become noisy, become tappety on its tappet shims. Even if the clearance goes pretty major and the engine makes quite a clanking, quite a rattling, this isn't going to be or shouldn't be a serious failure. If it's the exhaust tappet shim, then it can be fixed with the engine in place. If it's the inlet tappet shim, then unfortunately, because you can't get access to the variable cam timing on the inlet cam, to remove the inlet cam in situ means that you've got to take the engine out to re-shim inlet valves. Now, in terms of piston and liner, then there's not really any combustion related failures that commonly occur, and because the V8 engine doesn't ingest its cat debris, if there is a misfire, then you haven't got the catalyst debris that's going to compromise the piston and liner surfaces. So if V8s go wrong, it mainly is because they've spun a big end bearing. Could have been that the oil level was low, perhaps the water level has been low and it's compromised, a head gasket or something. Maybe there's been some oil crossover and the oil is low for that reason. Or if it wasn't that misuse or abuse, then a delamination of the top surface of the bearing rarely occurs, but it can occur, meaning that clearance between connecting rod and crankshaft is larger than it should be. That gives you that characteristic deep within the engine type knocking sound because the connecting rod is essentially rattling. And if you're mechanically sympathetic, then you don't run the engine any further. If you haven't detected the problem, or it just the onset happens so quickly that you don't detect it until it's too late, then the V8 has the potential, and does quite often, fail where the connecting rod sort of snaps, the piston is jammed up against the side of the block, and internal parts with very high kinetic energy try to get outside the block and it punches a hole in the block. The V12 engine has hydraulic lash adjusters instead of tappet shims on its valve train, and it is possible to renew all of those with the engine in situ. So just because the valve train was rattling, then this isn't a serious failure. The engine doesn't need to come out of the car. We all know about catalyst failure on the V12, and that's one of the most common causes of engine failure. You know, the debris gets into the combustion chamber and then it tries to pass underneath the piston rings, gets scuffed in the liner, and then that debris drops into the oil, gets sent around all the cam and crank journals, and the engine is pretty much unrepairable. The next common reason would be from low oil level, often because the breather circuit failed and there was a little bit of oil pullover and oil level was reducing as the engine was being run, and that's not detected by the owner dipping the oil and checking oil level on the dipstick. We know that the early DB9 engines can suffer the dreaded tick. This is where the small end bearing on the connecting rod is wearing and rattling, or maybe, and associated to it, there's been a little bit of piston and liner where the liner's worn oval, there's a little bit of piston slap, which develops to a noise that you just can't ignore anymore. It's very rare the V12 engine spins a big end bearing when the oil level hasn't been run low. Head gasket failure on both V8 and V12 is extremely rare. So those are the reasons why you might need to take your engine out of your Aston and repair it. At this point, there's two options. One is to repair it, and the other is to fit a remanufactured engine from the factory. The factory remanufactured engine for both V8 and V12 is exactly the same. They term it a long block. This is where you get a block and heads internally built with crank rods, pistons, valve train. So you haven't got any external ancillaries, wiring loom, exhaust system, inlet manifolds, oil, filter adapters, coolers, thermostat housings, all that sort of stuff has to be transferred from the old engine across to the new engine. For both V8 and V12, they haven't been able to supply that since at least the middle of 2020. The V8 engine was remanufactured for something like £9,800 plus VAT, and the V12 engine was something like £11,500 plus VAT. If they do remanufacture again, then I'd expect those prices to change, because they were already far too cheap. Cheap because you just cannot rebuild an engine if it needs major parts for anywhere close the cost of that remanufactured option, which meant the remanufactured option was actually the go-to option until they stopped making them available. Until a few years ago, they did stock brand new engines which were not remanufactured. I mean, these sold for about £20,000 and included inlet manifolds, wiring harness, exhaust manifolds, absolutely everything. But obviously they don't produce those engines on the production line anymore, so that option will never be available again. The key thing as to whether the remanufactured engine is good for you is that you have to give them a serviceable exchange engine. So if you've lost a big end bearing and you've shot the rod and piston out the side of the block and there's a hole in the block, that block can't be remanufactured, so you would have to pay their surcharge. The surcharge for not giving them an engine which can be remanufactured is 100% of the purchase price. So if that was £11,500 for your V12 engine, the V8 price will be just short of 20, but with fitting on the V8 and DB9 taking both prices to probably early to mid 20s, and looking at the price of those entry level cars on the marketplace, that's certainly a repair bill that needs thinking about for a long time. Of course, not the current second century Astons, so not your 5.2 V12 and not your Merc engine Astons, because these engines are going to be available probably brand new because they're obviously still producing them. But for your 4.3 or 4.7 V8 and your 6 litre naturally aspirated V12 engine in any derivative, because there are no remanufactured engines currently in stock, and if you lose an engine bad enough to not qualify for an exchange motor, then repairing in a dealer network isn't really an option. And if you had a failed engine, then the independent world is the best or only place to go. So the first key question is, you've got some sort of failure. Fundamentally, can that block be rebuilt? Now, obviously, if it's got a hole in the side of it, it can't. And if it's suffered catalyst ingestion and the liner is scuffed and it goes beyond a grade 3 piston, meaning that you have to use an aftermarket liner and machine out the factory liner, then those are all really big repair jobs. If it just spun a big end bearing and maybe it just needed crank, a few rods, new bearings, so it's simple parts and labour, then those are the types of failures that are rebuildable and often quickly. If the block needs a lot of remachining or the block is failed, then it's probably unlikely that you're going to be able to rebuild that motor. So on an engine that's exhibiting some nasty noises, it's best not to run it at all. But if you run it for a period of time just to understand what the failure is it connecting rod, big end bearing failure, is it just valve train, then pretty much immediately you can get a feel for the extent of a repair. But you'll only know that fully once you take the engine out of the car and you strip the engine down and lay it on a bench. Only then is it really possible to fix, quote, the repair process needed. But you're sort of committed inside a garage at that point because you've got your engine out of the car and the engine stripped on a bench. Failure on either the V8 or V12 is rare, and obviously because the entire process that I've just spoken about there is really uncomfortable and you don't want to get yourself into that situation. If you can at all avoid it, do your best to avoid it in the first place. Remember that £229 service video is a very conscientious technician doing that £229 service, going to listen for anything on the engine in an attempt to try check if there's the onset of any wear or nasty noises. I very much doubt it. So getting a service done and a service somewhere reputable is the best thing you can do to avoid anything which could have been caught early on. Next, in your ownership, regularly check oil and water levels. I would do this every 3 tanks of fuel. That's going to be something like every round 1,000 miles. So if you just made a mental note that at every round 1,000 mile you check your oil and water, then that's going to avert some of the failures that I see lots of where it has been customer misuse or abuse. Checking at service isn't just listening out for nasty noises. This is about having a look at the air filters, seeing if there's been any oil pullover. This is about pulling the throttle intake tube off, cleaning any oil pullover that is in the throttle body, which would affect idle and stalling, which is good service action to do. But at the same time, opening the throttle by hand, shining the torch up in the inlet manifold and seeing if there is an excess of oil sat in there. That's important because running low on oil is one of the major causes of engine failure. If you're unlucky enough to experience engine failure and it is a quick and simple fix, crank a few bearings, then at least there is light at the end of the tunnel and you'll be without the car for probably 8 weeks whilst that gets itself repaired, and apart from a dent in the wallet, then the episode will be over. If the repair needed is more severe than that, but basically the block is intact, then the remanufactured engine would be the next best route. But unfortunately the factory aren't showing any signs of stocking that anytime soon. The real problem is when an engine's lost, the block is not repairable and you don't qualify for the service exchange. The only option to fix an engine like that is to buy a second-hand unit that appears serviceable, refresh that and then put that in the car. Even in the most severe failures, hunting the second-hand parts market and rebuilding something will get an engine back in the car. The downside is going to be the time that takes. Because there were more cars sold in the UK than any other market, means that there are second-hand options available, either from flood damage, crash cars, or just cars that for whatever reason are uneconomic to fix and they end up being broken for bits. So that means in the UK then we do have a good second-hand market. If you were in a territory that didn't have that, and also you don't have a remanufactured engine because the factory aren't making them for UK, obviously means they're not making them for rest of the world. If you did have an engine failure, then at this moment in time that's a real problem, and if there wasn't a decent independent network in your country, then that's going to be really difficult to fix. Hope you like that forum chat and we'll see you in the next one.